discussions that I'll have about it, so give you an idea about what we're going to talk about. So, I'm a mature age student. I'm in my final year at Southern Cross University. I'm studying social science in sociology. My degree got trashed at the end of the year, and because of all the restructuring the university's done, they've decided not to offer honours programs the next 2 years. So I'm really looking for any academics who are looking for so I'd like to start this from talking about about the Accord and about the corporate head government and my own personal experience about that. I started work at 16 in 1985 for the Department of Social Security. This was before the public service reforms that took place. I'd worked for Social Security. I ended up working for CES, Department of Health, Housing and Community Services. I also worked for the State Housing Department and also State Community Services, and also in a number of funded community programs. And I did this for about 15 years until I started doing some other stuff. But that's pretty much where a lot of this information is going to come from. And I say this because a lot of the things that I would like to talk about today there isn't really a lot of academic work around it. So I want to sort of start that sort of conversation about some of the things that happened, about how we can actually find this useful for UBI. So this was the question that we were asked to look at, pathways for UBI in the next 10 years. And I honestly think there are 4 pathways within the country here. I can't remember who mentioned it earlier on about an international UBI. I mean, I honestly think that's probably one of the pressing motivations for a UBI. It's not necessarily, like, I'd look at the program and a lot of it seemed to be based upon pilot programs within communities, within towns, within states, within nations. One of the things I noticed when I was doing this research, though, there are a lot of United Nations bureaucrats who are actually starting to talk about a UBI, about how a UBI can be introduced. And where that fits in with what I'm going to talk about today is, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Michael Pusey's work. He wrote a seminal book on how neo-liberalism was influencing public service during the Hawke Keating years. And I was thinking about that in terms of United Nations. United Nations bureaucrats seem to be positive towards how a UBI can be towards a UBI. It also fulfills the social development goals that the UN has. And now it's a case, I suppose, of starting to get nations and political actors to get on board with that. So the next 10 years, can that happen? Well, it seems like that's a possibility. The other way for the UBI is through the Greens. I mean, I think after the last election, if they can maintain their gains and actually improve their gains, they essentially have the possibility to form government with Labor, and that then becomes on the cards and that's on the cards then. The third way, I'll put Liberals, and we're going to talk about this, about how a Liberal Party can actually reduce UBI in Australia based on some of the information we've seen today. And lastly, Labor, and to be honest, after doing this research, Labor's the hardest to ask. They will be the worst ones. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk about how our two-party system operates and how I look at using the variant analysis to see how they collude and they create this idea of the need to work. One of the things about the Protestant work ethic is, when I say it's enforced by both sides of politics, business and unions, I'll give you 2 examples. You probably would have been aware of Scott Morrison's comment about how to go, you get to go. I mean, that's pure Protestant work ethic type of thinking. From the other alternative is, like, when you start listening to the union movement talk about secure, permanent, full-time jobs, this again is reinforcing this narrative of the Protestant work ethic. So one of the things, though, when we talk about the Protestant work ethic, we don't actually talk about what Weber really highlights in terms of what Calvinism means. If you're having a go and getting a go, working hard doesn't make you successful. Working hard under the Weberian, under Weber's idea, is you have the possibility of becoming a member of the elect. So there is never going to be this idea that there's some sort of universalism or that we're all the same. There's always going to be this elitist system that he's arguing that's what the Protestant movement creates. And that elect, we can see that in the way that Labor frames its narratives. During the election, Anthony Albanese spent a considerable amount of his time talking about how he grew up in state housing to a single mum, and all of a sudden here he is now Prime Minister of Australia. It's a great story, but what he doesn't say is about how he got there. I mean, the reality is in Australia, the quickest way to middle class is a tertiary education. For someone like Anthony Albanese to become part of the political elite, he's joined the Labor Party when he's at university. But in his narratives, he doesn't talk about this. The other thing about these narratives too, these narratives aren't structural. If we talk about structural critique of what he's saying, single parent, well, if you're a child of a single parent today, you don't have the same economic advantages that he had when he grew up. When he talks about social housing, well, again, we don't have the same amount of social housing today. When we talk about public schools, when we talk about tertiary education, those advantages that he had are no longer available to people today. He's essentially asking for you to identify with him as the leader, not because you can become a leader yourself, but because he is someone who's made it. So the question, though, we have to ask, we're looking at how relevant is it? Does a Calvinistic worldview that developed in a culture that moved from medieval to industrialised nation, as opposed to what we have in Australia, how does that? They don't mesh. But what I came to realise is that if we replace this Calvinistic idea with the idea of laborism, we can actually see the same structures that Weber talked about in terms of how capitalism developed in Germany can be applied to Australia. And as you see that laborism's category first experience is common to British New Zealand and Australia, where the labour movement sought out specifically political representation of its interests, as opposed to the socialist perspectives from the European working class. Swan talks about laborism in his on the Labor Party website. He talks about laborism. This is his argument about why Labor isn't neoliberal, and he starts talking about, rather than being neoliberal, it's actually laborism. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does laborism mean? Responding to Elizabeth Humphrey's work on how Labor created neoliberalism, we see the right of the Labor Party produced a book, The Right Stuff, where they essentially tried to argue against this idea that neoliberalism neoliberalism was created by the Labor Party. I found it really interesting to read Humphrey's book. I didn't read The Right Stuff, but I read the reviews. Oh, you got that? Yeah, thank you. I was hoping someone would. Swan, famously, in arguing against Elizabeth's book, says, I haven't read the book. So, yeah, I've read the reviews. But one of the things about this is that in politics, you don't make great policy by arguing against your opposition. And I mean, I think that book itself, Swan's ideas, really show how there is a lack of intellectual depth within the Labor Party at the moment. Yeah, I mean, regardless of anything else, and I think that could. Oh, I'm a Labor Party member too. Yeah, so what interested me though with this idea of Labourism, we look at Pusey's work, and Pusey talked about how Australia was the great social democratic nation in the early 20th century, and that was usurped by Sweden. So this idea of Labourism is not a new idea. It's something that we can see is that it's what actually drives the Labor Party. What drives the labour movement, what drives the unions, isn't this idea of militancy. What drives them is the idea of political representation and using the government to create policies for workers. So how does the Labor Party do this? Well, we have two possibilities: redistribution, which creates a fairer, more equitable society, or the insurance system, which is we are capitalist, but we believe in what's the word? We believe in creating a standard of society, a standard in society. I mean, that's the best way to put it, I suppose. But it's a constant growth ideology. So in order for this insurance idea to work, there has to be constant growth. But the other thing too about it is that it actually forces people into, insurance is about the cost-benefit analysis of helping somebody as opposed to not helping somebody. And that's essentially what Labor have said that their policies are. So we're going to talk about economic rationalism as opposed to neo-liberalism. Economic rationalism was the prevailing political ideology of the Hawke-Keating government. I mean, is it neo-liberalism? Well, Swan says no. Humphrey says yes. One of the things about Cahill and Humphrey's article, also they talk about how in Cahill and Humphrey's article they talk about how the far right ideology that was also rising at the time didn't influence Labor's position. But one of the things I want to talk about, and this is in relation to this idea of Labourism, Hawke and Keating was essentially a continuation of the Whitlam project. The Whitlam project was cut short. So when we look at what Whitlam was doing, and we look at what Hawke and Keating did, we actually see the pathway through it. When people argue about Hawke and Keating cutting tariffs, well, the fact is that Whitlam cut tariffs by 50% during his prime ministership. When we talk about, say, for instance, a social wage, a social contract, things like childcare, it was actually Whitlam that introduced community-based childcare, not Hawke and Keating as a start. And even the idea of the Accord, it was Whitlam who argued that there needed to be a compact between organised labour and the Labor Party. So what is the Accord? The Accord basically involved unions voluntarily refraining from wage claims while a social wage was introduced. We're not going to argue about what it did or why. It includes Medicare, superannuation, childcare as an example. What I want to do though is not talk about superannuation and Medicare so much, but talk about how this social contract was produced in other ways and how some of those help us to look at how we can look at basic income as a possibility within the country. Pusey, in his book, he talks about a tripartite public service. So at the top was the Department of Finance, Treasury, and the Prime Minister and Cabinet. On the other side was industry assistance, and the other side was social services. In all the work that anybody's done in terms of neoliberalism, or the Hawke-Keating neoliberalism, it is this social contract services that is left. In Humphrey's book, there's a page and a half. It's quite critical, and it's quite brief, and it's not very detailed. So, for me, how I became interested in this is that I was reading Twitter one day, and so there was this woman talking about community funding and about how we can fund communities. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, hang on, I saw a program like this, and I worked in a program like this. So my assumption was I would just jump onto my university library webpage, and I would find a plethora of research about this. I found nothing. So I spent a bit more time. I must have spent 100 hours researching. I could find nothing. I've ended up putting in some information requests to the National Archives, and I'm going to Canberra probably in 2 weeks' time. I'm actually going to go and see if I can go and do the research myself there. So what I realised as I'm doing this, here's this lefty green, hippie green, talking about community funding. The same thing that this economic rational, neoliberal, Hawke Keating government actually did and actually funded. And for me, that just really shows how our entire political train of thought has shifted. It's the fact that here we have a right-wing Labor government introducing policies that people now are asking for from a leftist perspective. So I started doing some more research. So I want to talk about community funding models and how they started. The community funding models started basically in the asylum. After World War II, asylums became a growth business, basically because of the return servicemen. What was happening at the same time is that psychiatrists were also debating about what's the best way to treat these people. And while this is happening, and there are lots of discussions and lots of arguments about the problems that are happening in asylums, Irving Goffman wrote Notes from Asylums. It's a seminal sociological work about participant observation. He wrote that in 1961, and it became a hit straight away. In 1963, the Kennedy government introduced the Community Mental Health Funding Act. And what that act was about was moving mental health from this institutionalised governmental setting, which had horrific consequences for individuals, to a community-based, care-based, where its communities would be able to determine what's the best way to treat people and the best way to take care of people.
7 minutes.
Sorry?
7 minutes.
Okay. So that's essentially where the community funding model was. What made it popular was it was cheap. It was cheaper than government funding. So this is in the 1960s. So as time goes by, we start to see it become popular among in American governments, English governments, and also in Australian governments. So let's talk about some of the social contract stuff that's happened under the Hawke Keating government. Firstly, Bob Hawke Surf Team. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. If you're an unemployed person and you move to an area of low employment and you get suspended for 6 months, this is the Bob Hawke Surf Team. Bob Hawke Surf Team was about 100 young people who travelled around Australia. They would move they moved from places like care of the post office, Bluff Point, to care of the post office, Quarryma. So they literally were just surfing, and they would be moving between May and July. That was the best surfing times in Margaret River area. So what the DSS did, they cut them off. After that, the next thing they did is they employed hit squads. And literally, this is what they were called. Hit squads were basically mobile review teams that went around, and they had targets of people they had to just cut off benefits, and that was their goal. And they did this. That was the worst thing. They did this for like years until they ended up reforming payments. I put in Betsy Buchanan. Betsy Buchanan was a great advocate for social security recipients. She worked for the Sussex Street Legal Centre. She used the system. I mean, this is one thing about the Hawke Keating system, is that at the very least, they introduced checks and balances into what they were doing. What she did was use those checks and balances to basically defend a lot of people from the sort of attacks that social security were making. They called it Suck It Street, because when they beat Betsy, it was called Suck It Betsy. So that was social security. And essentially we're going to start moving into some of the different social contract changes made by the Hawke Keating government. Children's services, long daycare services, massive increase in funding, family daycare services. They started out of school care service funding and occasional care funding. These were all community-based. They were community-run, community-based services. They funded communities and they funded agencies. Even though these are labour market programs, they were deeply embedded in community-based management. In out of school care, it was a Hawke Keating initiative. They also looked at innovative program styles. So adventure playgrounds within the Radburn housing estates, they would introduce the adventure playground model, which was a little bit different from out of school care. Also youth activity services models, because they found that children over the age of 10 didn't attend out of school care services, so they developed a specific model for that. These are all gone now because as Howard moved into a market-based system, we remove all these sort of types of innovations. The JET program, Job Education Training for Sole Parents, when Gillard made her famous misogyny speech, that was at the same time as they made changes to the sole parents benefit. This is the start of it. This is where it came from. It was based on the Massachusetts Education Program for Sole Parents. It involved programs like the new Enterprise Scheme for Women, massive increases in childcare assistance to sole parents, in long day care services, in vacation care services, and it left a legacy of effectiveness. And so much so that all the changes that Howard made to the Hawke Keating funding arrangements, childcare assistance for the JET program never changed. What the JET program was, though, for the Hawke Keating government was it was voluntary, and that's probably one of the most effective things about it. The CYSS Skillshare model basically was designed so that the community-based education providers, at the same time, Keating had introduced the training levy, so that all employers over a certain amount of money, they had to spend 3% of all their 3% of their wages on training. And if they didn't, they got taxed. It funded things like Skillshare, again, another community service education provider. And I know people talk about the CES as being good, but at its height, CES only ever placed 12% of all job seekers. Most people actually got their own employment. Public service sector reform. So Pusey identifies a new legal theme amongst high-level bureaucrats. But when we read Fairbrother's work about the comparisons between the American and the UK and the Australian system, what we see is that this reform also opened up new opportunities. Equal opportunity meant that women were actively promoted. Graduate programs meant that you could develop some of the graduate programs meant that it took people straight from university straight to high-level policy jobs, so it gave them policy opportunities, intersectional policy development. These were all things that happened underneath these public sector reforms. So, our social contract framework, this is essentially what it's come down to. These are the differences between a government-run service, a community-based service under economic nationalism, and market-based service. So I'm just going to click through this and get to this one. So with these, how social aid, we're going to see this today, people that talk about arts. One thing that will be an expansion of the New Enterprise for Business scheme. The scheme's already there, it's already available, it can be extended to, for instance, arts. Arts is a classic example, but also too, just stimulating business within the community. CDPs, at the moment, I think Zoe Staines is talking about that in one of the other rooms. John Quiggin, has written about that as well. One thing I want to say about that, in tragedy commons, one of the ways to deal with climate change is to give people back public land and give them responsibility for that. So giving people back public land, attaching a UBI to that, is a way to combat climate change, and also help to introduce a UBI. Climate change, automation, industry restructuring. We've seen it in the car industry. We've seen it in fourth stage work on warehouse workers. Is that people lose their jobs, they're long-term employed, and they essentially go on top. One of the problems is that when unions are exiting from industry, they do what they can to. I mean, normally it's a case of how many years of service you get, so many X years of how many years of service gives you so many weeks of extra pay.
That's time.
So rather than actually putting that together into a rather than just giving people that, creating a fund, making government contributions, creating a training fund, and using a UBI for people who actually have their jobs restructured. Social security responsibilities, I'm just putting that in there for the idea that people who are students with using a HEX style system, social security reciprocal agreements were agreements between nations to support their social security systems. You could use that to introduce a HEX system for students. But the other one here, this is the big one that I want to talk about. Job search New Start. Nobody can say that unemployment today is not structural unemployment. So the Hawke Keating government, what they did is they made two different payments: job search payment for people for under a year, then the New Start payment. That New Start payment included specialised assistance and greater assistance. What I'm suggesting here is that you defund Job Services Australia, which is essentially useless and also corrupt. They're milking their clients for numbers. Using the defunding that, moving wage theft functions from, instead of introducing wage theft legislation, moving wage theft functions from the Fair Work Australia to the ATO means that you'll be able to, because again, it's not just wages, it's also tax that the government's missing out on the wage theft. Between those two things, you would have enough money there to basically fund a UBI for long-term unemployed people. And I'm going to leave it at that because.
Well done.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mark. And we'll just ask that questions can be taken at the end. We now have Iain Middleton talking about realising a basic income. So we're just going to set up the slides first.
Voice. Wonderful.
Right. I'm Iain Middleton from New Zealand, and Iain and I were two of the originators of the current basic income organisation in New Zealand. And there was a previous one that I believe faltered. And we're now trying to persuade various political parties and so on that basic income is a good idea. So, the question, what's the purpose of government? I've just done this very quickly. To collectively ensure the well-being of all citizens of the country. And I put emphasis on the word all, not some at the expense of others. And to ensure the equitable distribution of wealth. So it doesn't mean an equal distribution, it means an equitable distribution of wealth. I'd like to start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it has a number of articles which are probably relevant. Number 22, social security; 23, work; 24, rest and leisure; 25, an adequate standard of living. And then the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's a bit of a mouthful. It is binding on countries that have ratified it. And two examples, New Zealand and Australia have both ratified it. And the reason I quote this is that I find that when I actually go before a select committee, they actually take notice when you say that this is binding on New Zealand. So Articles 9 and 11 are of relevance. Number 9 is the right to social security, and 11 is the right to adequate standard of living. And how do governments meet these obligations? With a comprehensive system of benefits, with qualifying criteria targeted at those most in need. Jumped a bit. Why is that jumping off the screen? With abatements as other income increases. So this is how they're doing it currently. This is not necessarily the most desirable way to do it. Why do we have benefits or basic income? To ensure that those on the lowest earned incomes have sufficient total income to meet basic needs for living. Sounds good, but, and this is one of the major sticking points in New Zealand, the EMTRs, and that's the effective marginal tax rates, exceed 100%. So if you go out and earn $1, they take more than $1 off you. And that's a poverty trap. Now, I've always suspected that this was the case, and we have currently got a team working at Canterbury University on this, and one of the young students emailed me to say that she now has proof that this is actually happening. But she didn't give me any details, unfortunately, so I can't pass them on. But what happens is that when people on job seeker support in New Zealand go out and work, there's a threshold, and if they go beyond that, the job seeker support abates at 70 cents in the dollar. As well as that, they pay 10.5 cents in the dollar on the first income they earn. You add those together and it's 80.5 cents in the dollar, so that gives you an effective marginal tax rate. But behind that, they're also taking away the living allowance, which is paid in addition to the job seeker support. And that was what we couldn't find out for quite a while, at what rate that was being abated at, because it's not public knowledge. It's not available on the internet. And so she's been digging into that and trying to find the answer. Two people of interest wrote a book in 2017, and I just want to quote a little from their book. A basic income, once introduced, might be increased to 25% of GDP per capita over time. So that's not the initial rate of introduction. They're suggesting introducing it at a lower rate to start with and increasing it. They say it's important that basic income advocates do not waste too much time on the question of what they would regard as a fully adequate level of basic income. So it's more important to introduce a basic income than to start arguing about exactly how big it should be. And then they say trying to jump in one go to a full basic income, however precisely defined, would anyway be irresponsible. So excuse me for looking to the side all the time, but there's no screen in front of me. And I've just here looked at that 20 to 30% of GDP per capita, which people like them and Guy Standing are recommending. New Zealand has a GDP per capita of 69,600 when I looked it up the other day. 20% is $267 a week, 25% $334, 30% $400 a week. But a basic income is likely to cost less than you think. And one of the reasons would be that it replaces all benefits of equivalent or less value. So rather than have an add-on scheme, if you start replacing the benefits which are of equivalent or lower value, you can save on the actual upfront costs. So it would partially replace all benefits of greater value. It simplifies the welfare system, which is a good key reason for having a basic income. It saves on administrative costs. When the basic income is spent, 15% of money paid to people on low incomes is returned to the government as GST. So that's the New Zealand figure. I think it's lower in Australia, but we get 15% back straight away. And people have estimated that maybe it's up to 15% of more money is returned as income taxes, profit taxes, and so on. So the money that's not returned in that first round of expenditure is then spent again. It continues to circulate. And each time it circulates, you get an equivalent amount of money back. Basic income tends to increase the velocity of money, so that's the speed of circulation, because it's of a targeting towards those on low incomes. So people on low incomes, because they need to go out and buy necessities, they spend the money. People at the top of the chain have plenty of surplus money, so they save it up. And I overheard a conversation where some lawyers were talking about their annual trip to London to take in a few shows. So they tend to spend it at a lower rate. And another key factor of basic income is it tends to boost and stabilise the economy. So with a basic income, you tend to be putting income into low income regions of the country, and it's spent in those low income regions, and it tends to boost the economy in those regions, as well as boosting and stabilising the economy of the whole country. So benefits of basic income, in no particular order: improved incomes for those on low incomes, reduces the stress for those who have been on job seeker support or similar benefits, improves health outcomes, reduces crime rates, and these have all been found from pilot studies and so on around the world. I wanted to mention briefly the New Zealand pension because it was introduced in 1898 and it was a world leader at the time. It was a non-contributory pension. So this was what made it different to those in other countries, because there were other countries that introduced government pensions, but you had to contribute to them in order to get something from them. It was for those over 65 with few assets and of good moral character. I don't know who did the judging on that, but someone must have decided who was good moral character. It was means tested. 1938, the age was lowered to 60 when New Zealand superannuation was introduced. In 1955, it was lowered for single women unable to work. So it was lowered to the age of 55. In 1977, it was abolished by Sir Robert Muldoon when he lowered the age of New Zealand super to 60. So we'll get on to New Zealand superannuation. Now, I think this is quite important because New Zealand superannuation perhaps doesn't get as much attention as it might. And it's possibly the world's longest running basic income trial. Introduced in 1938, so it's been running for 84 years. It's non-contributory, you don't have to contribute anything at all in order to get it. It's not means tested, so everybody gets it. It's voluntary, and this is something that a lot of people miss. that you only receive it if you actually ask them to pay you. But most people actually like the thought of free money, so they do apply for it. It's paid directly from the consolidated fund. And it's payable to all New Zealand residents over 65. So you don't have to actually be a citizen, you have to have residency. And there are some requirements regarding years in New Zealand. The operating costs of it are very, very small. It's suspended if you leave the country for 3 months. And it terminates when you die. The base rate is 65% of annual average wage. And that's what I understand it to be. But it's paid at 3 different rates. So the basic rate is a couple, and you can see there it's paid as a gross sum, and there's a net figure there as well. So it's added on to your income for the year, and you get taxed on it. So the second rate is for the first rate is for couples, and the second rate is for single people, but sharing accommodation. And Susan St. John says, well, who actually goes around and looks through the windows to see whether they're sleeping in the same bed or not? So it creates a little administrative problem there. And then there's another rate for single people living alone. And as I pointed out before, it's taxable with progressive with your other income. It's been virtually unchanged since 1938. 1977, the base level was increased, and at the same time, age of eligibility lowered to 60, and that's when the pension was abolished. We have had some periods when politicians have thought that they had to clamp down on it because of a perceived likelihood that it might become unaffordable. It wasn't actually unaffordable, they just thought it might become unaffordable. And they wanted to cut expenditure for other reasons. Dr. Jess Gerritsen-Shaw, who's known in New Zealand, has made some fairly nice comments about it. She says, it's been a fantastic basic income. She said, we had severe poverty in the over 60s before we implemented a universal basic income, and we've been very successful in driving down poverty in that age group. But what we saw during the global financial crisis was that the over 65s did fine, because the money was kept on coming, it was automatic, it was there, it kept on coming, and it actually kept a lot of the retailers going. So while other people were being hit hard, the over 65s were still doing fine. Other groups, particularly people with young children, we saw an increase in poverty during the global financial crisis. So the question is, how is it funded? And this is something that people haven't, I felt, really looked at closely enough. So money paid out produces economic activity. The money spent generates GST, economic activity, and as I've mentioned before. So the money continues to circulate, and you get the multiplier effect. Comes in, you spend some money, the government spends some money. Multiplier effect means that money keeps circulating and generating more economic activity. But when the tax from the first expenditure comes back in, you can then use that to pay part of the next payment. And so the second payment is smaller, the third one becomes smaller again, and so on. And that means that the money required to run New Zealand Super actually reduces over time. So when it was first introduced, there were all the naysayers saying, the government will never be able to afford it and so on. But in fact, in 1938, when New Zealand was not a wealthy country, they were able to introduce a superannuation scheme, which was effectively a basic income, and it didn't bankrupt the country as the naysayers said it would. After a period, the tax being returned is almost equal to the money being spent. And so you could say it becomes self-funding. So after 84 years, New Zealand Super is a very mature scheme. Money was required to introduce it initially, but it can now be considered to be a mature scheme, and effectively the tax being returned keeps it going. Cuts in spending in New Zealand Super will result in corresponding reductions in tax revenues after a lag. Now, in the early 1990s, we had a government who decided that they had to clamp down on expenditure, and guess what? All the taxes went down, and it doesn't actually make things particularly better. And also, if you cut New Zealand Super, you're likely to get an increase in poverty amongst the elderly people in the country. So there are very good reasons for not actually cutting it. And governments seem to more or less have realised that in New Zealand now. It's not the best thing to target. So if we take a look at the graphs, and I've just produced a simple graph there, and that shows the tax return in each period. So New Zealand superannuation is paid fortnightly, but the rate that money is actually circulating is different. So I saw Professor Ute Fisher giving a talk on basic income in Hyderabad, and she was talking about the payment at the beginning of the month and the tax return at the end. But I think you need to realise that the rate that money is circulating and the period at which the basic income is being paid are not the same. And so you have to put them into as independent variables into your calculations. So the tax collected, when you spend a basic income, you get tax back from the first period, the second period, and so on. And you can represent that by a simple equation there, which just says the sum of the money is from period 1 to infinity. And guess what? That equals 100%. So if you spend any money on something like New Zealand Super, as it circulates, the government will take a bit back each time it circulates until eventually they get it all back. So as long as the country has taxation, the money paid out will eventually come back. So taxation is actually a very important part of an economy. It balances an economy. You pay out, money comes back, and that gives the government money to pay out again. So you need both sides of the equation to get a functional economy. And the time it takes for the money to come back depends on both the tax rate and the speed of circulation of money. So in this table here, I've just tried to represent that a different way. In the top bar, you can see the first payment comes back in a series of tax payments. The second payment occurs in the second period, and then again it comes back as a series of payments. Now, you can actually add that up either vertically or horizontally. So if you add it horizontally, as I've shown in the equation before, 100% will eventually comes back. But if you add it vertically, so if you look at period 2, you get a tax 1 return plus a tax 2 return, and you're actually getting the same equation. And you can similarly add up the payments. The payments for n periods is equal to the same sum. And again, it'll equal 100% if you take it to infinity. So, this is telling you the same thing, that the equation for the payments is the same as the equation for the taxation. So the two balance one another. And then the next part of it is the new money required. Now, when the government pays out for the first period, it actually has to get that money from somewhere else. And The second period, it has the tax return from the first payment, which it can use to offset the payment. So as time progresses, the amount of new money that the government requires from somewhere else reduces. And so in words there, the new money for any period is equal to the total payment for that period, less the total tax collected from the previous period. And there you can see it graphically. So the new money is the blue line, which declines over time. And the orange line, or brown line, whichever you like to call it, indicates the tax being returned. So as the tax being returned increases, the amount of new money that you require decreases. And just looking at that, being a sort of someone has a bit of maths background, I thought, well, what about the accumulated new money required? And so I've graphed that there, and that shows that if you add the new money you require for the first period plus the new money for the second period and so on, it's getting a smaller amount each time. So the total new money that you require actually becomes asymptotic. And in that example there, I think it says 120% of the first year's payment. So, sorry, the first year's payments. So that means that if the total amount of money you require in the first year, total payments made in the first year are $1 billion. $1.2 billion will keep you going indefinitely. So that's the accumulated new money that you require, and that's a finite sum of money. It's not infinite. So most people just look at it and say, right, well, take the first year payments, and for 10 years it's going to take us 10 times that amount of money. It's not so. There's a limit on it. It flattens out. And what's happened now? So here I've graphed the time that it takes for a basic income to become self-funded. So the bottom line represents 50% self-funding, and the top line represents 99%. And it depends on the rate that money is circulating. And you can see that the faster it circulates, the less the time required for it to become self-funding. So looking at realising basic income, we're talking about extending the existing New Zealand basic income. So that's the superannuation to include 18 to 64-year-olds. And I've restricted it to that group here because you also have child basic income. But just to simplify the discussion for this meeting, I've restricted it to 18 to 64-year-olds. And anyone over 64 is already getting one. So new external money will be required. The total new money required to start the scheme is finite. It's not the product of the annual payments times the number of years. And I've written down here 6 rules to minimise the cost of a basic income, because there is an advantage in minimising the cost of a basic income. So there's actually 2 conflicting things you need to do. One is maximise the basic income for those on the lowest incomes, and at the same time minimise the total cost of the basic income. So the first rule I've said is keep the income basic. Second, replace existing welfare benefits where possible. So you can't replace the lot, because someone pointed out earlier there's invalids and so on who actually require more money for special reasons. Make the scheme voluntary. And we've illustrated that works with New Zealand superannuation. And people usually don't turn down free money. Couple a basic income with an appropriate tax. And I've used the word appropriate because there are some tax schemes which are better than others, and you need to be a little bit careful about what an appropriate tax is. Improved targeting, and just as a matter of interest, anybody here that actually heard of the Alm model? The Alm model was developed at the University of Ulm. Perhaps 20 years ago. I couldn't figure out exactly how long ago it was, and I couldn't find much about it because, well, anything that I did find was written in German, which complicated it a bit. So I was sort of left to reinvent the wheel. Phase the income, basic income over a period, and that's quite possible, particularly when you realise that you can have a voluntary basic income.
It's 5 minutes.
5 minutes. So here I've done some more graphics. So the grey line there, on the left you've got the net income, on the bottom gross income. The grey line represents zero tax line, and the Germans call that the income line. The blue line is the current net income with progressive tax. And that's the progressive tax rates that we have at the moment over the top. Now if we took 33% as a uniform tax rate or a flat tax, we get that effect. So it actually lowers everybody's incomes. But unfortunately, and you can see it here, the people on the left are people on the lowest incomes. Their incomes drop quite significantly, while the people on higher incomes don't lose so much as a percentage. If we put in $175 as a basic income, and this was what was proposed by Keith Franklin, you get a nice line like that, which provides a basic income on the left to people on low incomes, but nothing to people over $70,000. Now, I think when he first proposed that, $175 was the job seeker support rate, and it's no longer sufficient for a basic income. So bump it up to 315, which is the current job seeker support rate, and you get this line here. Now, what that is showing you is that the people on the left get a reasonable increase in income. So it's a very basic income. The people on the right, who are the wealthy, are still getting quite a sum of money. So what they were trying to do with the Alm model, there's another slide in between. So this actually shows that the percentage increase in income for people on low incomes is actually very high. And people on high incomes get a very low increase in their percent increase in income. So from that respect, it's working quite well. And then looking at it another way, the blue line at the top is the present income, net income system. But the orange line is what happens to the effective tax rate, which is the average tax you pay on all the income you earn. And you can see that the people on the left, the low income people, becomes a negative tax. So the basic income is a very efficient way of introducing a negative income tax. And going back to our previous graph, the old model actually introduces a higher rate of taxation for people before what they call the transfer limit, and that's where the line, the orange line, hits the grey line, the no tax line. And they usually use 50%. I think you can get away with a lower percentage than that. But the Germans were using 50%, and you can see then that it pulls the line back down so that those on high incomes get a very small increase in income. And you can go a little bit further and you can pull it right back down. So what that does is the threshold is set at the second point. The second when it hits the blue line, not where it hits the grey line. So up in the top left corner, and we just perhaps go through those again.
It's 1 minute.
Yeah, the cost of a basic income with this scheme would be $30 billion per annum. With the old model, it comes down to $18 billion, and with the modified old model, it comes down to $15 billion. So it pulls it right down again. And in the slides here, I've been able to show that using what I described previously for the New Zealand superannuation, because of the circulation of money, that the actual total amount of money that you require reduces right down to $0.3 billion per annum. And that's after the 10th year. So you're still making the same amount of payments per annum, but by looking at these different ways of, first of all, saving money and then the circulation of money, you've pulled the annual cost right down to a fairly low figure.
That's time now.
Sorry?
That's time.
Time, right. Well, I'll stop. There's just a few more slides, but I'll stop now.
Thank you so much.
So thank you to our two speakers. Before I open for questions from the audience, I just wanted to acknowledge that Alana Wennerstrom from the University of Sheffield was also going to present on whether the UK government could implement a universal basic income. Unfortunately, she was unable to make it. However, she's putting together a resource for people that will be available online through the archive of the Basic Income Congress. So it'd be another good one to follow up on. Okay, so I turn now to open to the audience for questions, and if you can sort of direct it to your question to a specific person, we'll get them to respond. So,
Can we also, I'm sorry to be a pain, but can we have the person answering just to speak up here? You're welcome to move your chairs over just for the microphone for the people online.
so if you get
Thank
asked,
you.
might just need to jump up.
I've got a question. In one of your in one of your slides, you mentioned that it approaches 120%. Do you remember why it's 120? I thought it was just a strange point to end up at.
I think what you're referring to is the effective marginal tax rates. Now, in New Zealand, if you receive job seeker support, you're allowed a certain amount of money before they start to abate your job seeker support. And then it's abated at 70 cents in the dollar. But you also have to pay tax at 10.5%. You earn a bit more and then it actually jumps up to 17.5% tax. So you've got to add those two together and that gives you the effective marginal tax rate. But what is not available on the internet, and we've been trying to find out, is that a person on job seeker support is also paid an additional sum of money, which is the living allowance, which is paid according to the region where you live. And so it's paid at 4 different rates. If you live in Auckland, which I think is the most expensive place to live, it's paid at the highest rate. So they also abate that, but they abate it from the first dollar you earn, as I understand it. So you have to add that in. You then have to add in any other abatements and cuts that they might be doing at the same time. And you can also perhaps add on, when a person goes out to work, they have transport costs and they have clothing costs and maybe extra food costs and so on. So they all have to be added on. And then you end up with this effective marginal tax rate. Now, one of our students has informed me by email just before I came here that she has found the proof that the effective marginal tax rate is exceeding 100%. Now, she didn't say 120%. She just said exceeding 100%. And I would like to see exactly what she's found. And I think I have to wait for their report. They're doing it for an honours degree, I think. So no doubt we'll get the information in due course. Does that answer you?
Yep.
Okay.
Just repeating the questions.
Oh,
I just put it online.
sorry.
No,
I was going to
that's-
ask if there's a microphone. That's okay. Yes, down the back, sorry. Yes.
Well, I have two questions on Martin. Second to Iain. The first one, Martin, you started your presentation with a Bavarian analysis and said about this Protestant rocking moral. And I would like to ask you, what do you think about this Bavarian rocking moral? Is it outdated for the UBI watch, or do we need a new ethic? Do we need a new rocking moral?
So was it the rocking model?
Working.
Yeah.
Working.
No, I know.
Sorry, the question was about the rocking model.
Look, I think one of the problems is that in terms of introducing a universal basic income, politically, this idea, if we use it as Bavarian analysis, is that it's problematic. A universal basic income is problematic. My point I was trying to make in my presentation is that in terms of Weber, we could take his model, we replace this idea of the Calvinist determinism that's inherent in Protestant work ethic, and we replace that with the concept of laborism. We should be able to reproduce the same sorts of capital outcomes that we've seen under Weber. So the reality is, for a UBI, we do need a different narrative. We need to develop a different model. That is one thing I didn't really explain too well, is that our problem is that what we say, these ideas of the Bavarian idea doesn't fit in with the idea of universal basic income. And for us to introduce universal basic income, we're going to need to look at developing different narrative structures.
This different narrative structures. Do we think the work is moral obligation or not?
Moral obligation?
In this new narrative.
It's the problem. Weber was about moral obligation, and capitalism is based on its morality. I'm not so sure. What I would like to see is, say, for instance, Carol Gilligan's Ethics of Care. It's a great example of how you can both be flexible in terms of how you deal with a problem like this. It's also about the relationships that people have in community. This is one of the things that I wanted to try and highlight, is that this move away from neo-liberalism requires us to move back to a community-based focus, and a socially coherent based focus instead of individuality.
And I have a second question to Iain. To your 6 rules of basic income, you said basic income to keep basic. And what is the measure for basic? Or what is the measure for this basic? What is basic? In other words, what is the difference from basic to the unemployment benefits, for example?
The question is about what is basic for the measure of basic income, but also where you were talking about the 0 to 6 year olds. Where you're talking about the 0 to 6 year olds as well, with that payment. So what does basic mean?
So I was restricting the talk to people aged 18 to 64. And the basic I defined it as between 20 and 30% of GDP per capita. And anything outside that range probably isn't basic. So in New Zealand we have also the minimum wage and the living wage. And the minimum wage is the minimum amount that a person can be legally paid for paid work. So a basic income is usually set below the minimum wage. So if you set it above the minimum wage, there'd be no point in working because you'd be getting more money by staying at home on the basic income. I mean, it's just achieving a balance. And the 20 to 30% is, and I think Guy Standing recommends 25% in his book. So I'm just drawing on those figures. I haven't done research or anything like that to say that that's the ideal range, but I'm using the work of others to try and establish a basic level that we can work to. Now, it just happens that the New Zealand job seeker support comes almost in the middle of that range, 20 to 30% of GDP. So I thought, well, that's very convenient to look at a level for a basic income. You can just easily convert the job seeker support into a basic income. And then, as they recommend, you can perhaps increase it over time so that it actually comes out at a higher level. The New Zealand superannuation, as I've said, is a basic income, and it lies at the top end of that, about 400. Well, I think it's still under $400 a week for most of the figures, but it gets in the upper area of that 20 to 30%. Now, there's a question of relativities, which is always important, that you need to retain relativities between different groups of people. And the principle has always been that people over 65, a lot of them are incapable of work. And so they are actually paid more. But people under 65, then you set the basic income level at a lower level because they do have the alternative of going out and work if they possibly can. So if you introduce basic income, you have to think about the relativity between those under 65, those over 65. And also, of course, relativities with other people like invalids and sickness beneficiaries that may need extra. Is that sufficient answer?
Yes, I think about this very interesting question for me because it's a problem to confuse this unemployment benefits with basic income, and I think about what are the difference and what is the reason. So
And
your presentation gave me many things to think about.
So some people are actually suggesting introducing basic income at quite a low level. And some of the trials, I believe, have shown that even at a very low level, having a basic income actually is quite worthwhile. And so that they're thinking about, in some countries, India, maybe you can introduce it at a very low level and just bring it up over time as it starts to circulate and the money's circulating and the economy's improving and so on. So that's one point. At the other end of the scale, we have people who like to go in at a very high level of basic income, and I'm very wary about that sort of thing because if you try to introduce a very high level of basic income, and my understanding from Guy Standing was that what happened in Switzerland was that they were having a referendum of whether they should have a basic income or not. But some enterprising newspaper reporter looked on the basic income website and found a blog there or whatever, an article written by someone that suggested a very high level of basic income. And it was then used by the anti-basic income people as a reason to not have a basic income because it couldn't be afforded. It would cause massive immigration to Switzerland and various other reasons. So that's another reason for not going in too high at the beginning, to get something which can be afforded. And the situation we have in New Zealand is we need to go to the government. And in New Zealand we've got two political parties which are sympathetic to basic income at the moment. One is the top party, which has it as its major platform, but has never managed to get very far in the elections. The second is the Green Party, which has it as a long-standing part of their policies, but didn't push it in the last election at all. And then we've got the Labor Party who are actually in power at the moment. And I think in the Labor Party there are people who are divided on the question of whether we should have a basic income or not. When we had the economic downturn, I was actually able to contact some cabinet ministers and promote a basic income, but it was not considered at the end because the welfare department and the tax department both said we don't have the bank accounts and addresses of all the people in New Zealand we need to send this to. And that was the reason they turned it down. And if it was introduced as a voluntary scheme, you can go and sign up for it, then it probably would have worked. But because these government departments were saying, we don't have these addresses and bank accounts, they went for this employee subsidy scheme. And the people who were actually already on job seeker support missed out entirely because they were not employed. They introduced a second payment for people who had lost their work because of the COVID shutdown, and they were paid at a higher rate than people who've been long-term on job seeker support. So in some respects it was fundamentally unfair. And then more recently we've had a government's introduced a scheme, and I think this might be a try-out for a basic income, where they've paid out a cost of living payment to people, effectively to everyone who's employed. But they've used the tax department to do it, and they've run into all sorts of anomalies because the tax department has bank accounts for people that haven't been living in the country for years. And so they've suddenly received money, and that's got into the news media and so on. But again, if it was introduced as a voluntary scheme, and if you want this money, just sign here, it would probably have worked.
Is there some statistic about people who obtain all these basic income? How motivated are these people to work?
Sorry, I can't quite get.
People who obtain all the basic income are different from job seeking, right? And are there some statistics about how motivated are people obtaining basic income to grow, to search for to work?
So,
What is the motivation?
How motivated are people to receive it?
how motivated to work with people who receive basic income?
People receive basic.
Yeah, because similar to what the other payments, they put an incentive, so how motivated.
Perhaps I'll start by answering that people on job seeker support at the moment are demotivated from working because of the very high EMTRs, the effective marginal tax rates. And we have people on job seeker support, they go out and they find that they're actually worse off. And I knew one man who was on job seeker support. He had a family at home, he'd lost his employment, went on to job seeker support. He worked 2 part-time jobs in a week and informed the tax department, the welfare department as he was required to. And they cut his job seeker support for 3 weeks. So he got nothing from that. And so when people go out and work and they find that they're actually losing more money than they're getting from working, then that is a major disincentive to work. I know people who are on New Zealand superannuation, they're over 65, and they know that if they go out and work, any money they earn, they can keep after tax. So they've actually got quite an incentive to work. So the number of people who are not retiring at 65, it used to be compulsory retirement at 65, but now quite a percentage of people keep working. So they're receiving superannuation, they're also receiving wages for the work that they're doing. And there are no New Zealand statistics because we haven't had a trial for people 18 to 64, what would happen with a basic income, but there are overseas trials which indicate that people are actually more inclined to work if they're on a basic income than if they're on job seeker support or unemployment benefit. So despite all the things which have been introduced to try and force people to go out and work, they actually are more likely to find work if they're on a basic income. And that was the final outcome of the Finnish trial, that people on the basic income are more likely to find work. And in Finland, they were only trialling it with long-term unemployed. So they were perhaps the least inclined to find work. But once they went on to a basic income, they were more inclined to find work than they had been before. So is that answering the question? Something to think about.
Yeah, and maybe you could chat in the break as well. And follow up with Iain. I think that it's a great, actually, one of the critical questions, I think, that Guy Standing and Philippe Van Paris will respond to, amongst others. And it taps into yours, Mark, in terms of that work ethic and that expectation that we might have on people to continue working with basic income. Any final questions before we round off? Feel free to visit and go and say hello to Mark and Iain. I think, in terms of transformation aspect of this particular Congress, each presentation contributed to increasing the knowledge a bit more about what we need to think about on that pathway to a basic income and some of the different modelling, but also, addressing some of those structural inequities, particularly around that Protestant workers. Would you join me in thanking each presenter? And yourselves for coming along to this session. Thank you.